Yeah, hello everyone, and welcome to this working group session. Um, Thank you for joining, and this is indeed our wrap-up session for this working group, finalizing guidelines for fair adoption in health research performing organizations, or HRPOs. So today we will just take you through the work we have done and the outputs we've created. And we hope that the guidelines, which are still in a draft form, but nearly finished, will be of use to this field of research. And well, we want to show you what we've done. So next slide, please. I should also say, introduce ourselves. We won't get a chance to introduce everyone, I guess, in the room, but my name is Ben Katz. I work for OpenAir and also the EOS Future project. And I've been involved in this working group since my previous job for the Digital Curation Center. And also as part of the Fair for Health project, where a lot of this work originally came from. Anu, Kristen, Celia, do you want to just quickly introduce yourself as well?
Sure. My name is Anu Gururaj. I work at the National Institutes of Health in the United States. I work in the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, where the focus is essentially on immunology and infectious diseases. My interest is in data management, and I also oversee a repository. So I have a keen interest in fair data sharing and repository management. I'm one of the co-chairs for this group, and I hope to get, or rather we hope to get, feedback from the working group on the outputs that has been produced by the working group. Thanks. Kristen?
Thanks, Anu. I'm Kristen Kang. I work at the Australian Research Data Commons. I'm the manager of a program called HSANDA, which is a program looking to implement fair findability and accessibility of clinical trials data sets in Australian health research organisations. My background is in health and medical research, primarily in ageing and dementia research before moving across to ARDC, where I oversee infrastructure development. Thanks, Celia.
Hi, hello everyone. My name is Celia. I'm healthcare engineer and I work as a researcher at the Virgen del Rocío University Hospital as part of the Andalusian Health Service in Spain. I took part of the Fair for Health coordination team. This working group expanded the work done in Fair for Health, and now I work in different national and international research projects with the purpose of the application of the FAIR principle in the health file. I think that this is all. Thank you.
Thank you. Right. So before we move on to Ava, our guest speaker, we just had a couple of questions to ask of you, the audience. And you have this code that you should hopefully see in the shared notes document, as well as in the chat window of the Zoom session, which I know maybe not all of you are going to see because you might be in the room. But if you can go into that and type in this code as well, then you should see this page that we're sharing with you on screen. And we just wanted to get an idea of who's in the room, what background you have. And so feel free to please share that with us. Maybe that was all. Okay. Okay. If we can move on to the next slide then. Then another question that we just had for you is, where are you from? Which continent? Again, this is of relevance to what we're doing because we're trying to create something that is applicable on a global scale. So we were just trying to get an idea of that. Okay, so Australia, Europe, North America. Okay, and Celia? Mary is in the room, and she's the only one in the room. Okay, I see. Okay. So next slide, please. So yes, this is the meeting agenda, and so we're just going to take you through a brief introduction and then the findings from our landscape analysis, impact assessment, and a survey that we conducted. And then we'll actually go through the presentation of the guidelines that we've put together for fair policy adoption. Then we'll discuss potential early adopters, next steps. And we also have another guest speaker at the very end, Beth, who will be talking about the Domain Ambassador Program as part of the RDA and the EOS Future project. But before doing so, I'm going to hand over to Ava just to give us this first bullet point on an introduction. Ava.
Okay, thank you so much for giving me the floor. For me, today is a real special day because I always tell that I'm the godmother of this group because I put together all this fantastic team. I was part of a Fair for Health project, and I do really identify that it was needed to have a real recommendation from the bottom up, like REA led us to, from the health research performing organizations, because my concern was that in general, fair initiatives, fair policies come up with a lot of specificities, with a lot of technicalities, but the people that they can take the rules, that they can take the policies, they are not completely aware of what is fair. So the aim of the working group was creating these guidelines for the fair implementation in health research performing organization in order to give the policymakers in the health research something like a guideline to move on the policies. So that's why I'm so happy today, because at the end of this working group that I didn't follow that as much as I wanted, but we did both in the RDA plenary in Philadelphia, and then we did another one, and then we did another one, and finally we get up on the real working group assessment. And the point is that we want to extend this Perform Health, Fair for Health project to the whole world. And in the first meeting that we did in the both in, I think it was in Helsinki, or second one probably, I remember that every question that we posed to the audience, it was clear an answer from the United States, an answer for Australia and Oceania, and an answer from Europe. So the engine of this working group is a project, a European project. Actually, I remember that I have a discussion that sometimes we have to take this cues of having a project, a funded project, to make the bottom-up discussion. Because sometimes we are very interested in the topics, but if we don't have the real reason in our schedule, which is like a person month in a project, it never happened anything. So I'm super happy to see how Anu and Venkat and Celia and I don't remember your name, Christian, sorry, that you identify in your personal behavior, in your personal interests, the whole world. I mean, we always forget the Latin America and other countries, but I think these recommendations can really be applicable for any health research performing organization in the world. And I think the work that you have done, guys, is amazing. And I'm really convinced that it's going to be something like a recommendation that will be embraced for the health research performing organizations, even if they don't know what is the technicalities of being fair. I always say that FAIR is the best acronym ever after LASER. In something like 10 years time, nobody will remember what it stands for, but everybody wants to be fair. So findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable in health institutions is the way to go. And actually, I think these recommendations and all the work that you have done is really interesting and really important for this the health environment. And actually have a discussion today in a meeting that at the end, when you go to send or to be aware of science for the society, at the end, health is what it smooths the floor of everybody, because you can say I'm a researcher in library science, which is my case, but I will never discover the vaccine for COVID-19. So the things that really moved research is health, because it's about our, our real instinct as human beings. So thank you so much, guys, for taking over this working group. I'm super happy, Godmother, and congratulations for the work.
Thanks, Eva. So that gives you a brief overview of where this group came from. And indeed, Eva is the godmother of this group, having had the initial idea for this and passing it on to us. And so what we're going to present to you is a continuation of that, and ultimately the outputs that we have generated. So next slide, please. So the first thing that we'll just briefly mention, because and only briefly, because we presented this at least at the last two RDA plenaries. So I don't want to go into too much detail, and indeed it hasn't really changed that much since the last time. It does need updating, I will say that, especially to reflect recent developments, recent projects that have come about. But overall, it is representative of what's going on in the world right now. So it is a global analysis. It has required us to do a lot of the desk research, and indeed we know for a fact that there will be gaps in there. And we ask participants to have a look, and yeah, if there are things that you know that should be there, we would welcome your comments on this, and we'll try to address those. Indeed, if you feel like writing something, then maybe that would be good as well. But we want to have a full coverage across the world, especially the more underrepresented areas like in Africa and Latin America. Unfortunately, there is a real skew towards Europe, North America, and Australia, but a lot of the FAIR principles and their adoption, yeah, that is really where the main focus has been. But we know that there are other regions, of course, that have tried to embrace it, and we would love to know about that. I'm just going to actually leave it there. The link to the landscape document is in the chat window, and indeed there's a link to it from the shared notes document as well. So if we go on to the next slide, please, and I think Celia is just going to briefly take us through this.
Yes, as well, the impact assessment document is shared in Drive, and we have shared the link on the collaborative notes document. The main purpose of this impact assessment was to gather the main societal, financial, technical, and scientific consideration for the adoption of these FAIR policies in the health research performing organizations. Firstly, in the Google Doc on the impact assessment, we have the first section about the societal considerations. And there we have important reference about the the most fundamental example, that is the COVID pandemic, where the collaboration of a lot of researchers around the world allowed important societal impact. Also, data reusability, data sharing has demonstrated important scientific impact. And another important reference that is in this document is about the financial impact, because we have a reference of the report published by the European Commission about the cost of not having FAIR data in our research studies. So please go to this Google Doc, and you can add more reference, more considerations for the assessment of this impact of the adoption of FAIR policies. And now, if you agree, we can continue with the findings related to the survey that we disseminated.
I should also say, maybe if there are any questions, please do type them into the chat window, and also in the shared notes document, if you can fill out your name and affiliation and email address there as well. And also, I think there's a section there for questions too, if you wish. Sorry, Anna.
No, that's fine. Also, please feel free to speak up. I think we have sufficient amount of time for us to be able to address the questions if any come up during the course of our presentation. So with the reference to the community survey that Celia talked about briefly, I would like to share the intent behind the survey, the methodology that was essentially used to conduct the survey, and some results that was gleaned from the survey, as well as additional data. Cecilia, could you share the document, please?
Yes.
So Celia's pulling up the document. I would like to say that the intent for us to actually do the survey was to gather information from folks around the world and get a sense of how many folks were familiar with the concept of just data sharing, fair data sharing, and also familiar and to gather information on whether any policies existed within various organizations and countries with reference to data sharing and also fair data policy. So this survey was designed and discussed within the working group. And after discussion and finalization of the survey, it was disseminated to multiple stakeholders. A big shout out to Celia, who actually spearheaded the outreach effort to ensure that we were able to disseminate the survey to a large audience. The survey was divided essentially into 6 parts. The first was to gather some information about the survey respondent themselves and the organization that these respondents belong to. The second part of the question survey dealt with the questions about the policies, the potential policies either from the organization or the country or the funding agencies that these respondents belong to with reference to data sharing in general. Part 3 was was pretty much the similar questions, but focused on whether there were fair data sharing policies, and then whether the organizations or countries had any public statements that delineated their policy on fair data sharing. And then the part 5 focused of the survey focused, I think, on the most interesting aspect, which is talking about potential barriers to fair data sharing and any future plans that the respondents were aware of for fair data sharing by their organizations, funding agencies, or the countries to which they belonged. So the last part was just gathering of demographic information and contact information if they were willing to provide it to us. So the last one was obviously completely optional, and we were glad to see that there were quite a few folks who indicated that they would be happy to have follow-up conversations with the working group to provide additional information. So coming to the survey results, I will just kind of gloss over in some sense all of the summary stats that were collected. We got about 94 responses to our survey, and there were about 6 respondents who essentially didn't complete even the first part of the survey. So we basically decided to not include the responses in any of the analysis that were done. We had about 52 people that completed all the sections, including future fair policies. But that's not to say that all questions in all the sections were completed by everybody. So we do have a little bit of missing data within the survey. And the details of all of the numbers are provided in the document that's available, which is the survey results report. And please feel free to take a look at it. And if you have any questions, please also feel free to stop me in between to ask for the questions. As I think is mostly been was anticipated, most of our responses essentially came from public organizations. And a lot of our responses actually was from Europe, which was not very surprising. The interesting result that was unexpected was that we also had about 11% of our responses coming from Africa, which was not anticipated, and we were really gratified to see that we had a good response from Africa to the survey. Again, most of the folks that responded to the survey belonged to either research institutions or were part of a university setting. I believe that the responses from Africa that we got was due to an effort from one of the working members of the members of our working group who reached out to their community within Africa to disseminate the survey that we had. Surprisingly, most of the survey respondents identified themselves as managers of some sort, either of a project or of a data repository or a database manager. Not many of them were actually researchers. But then this might be due to the fact that most of our outreach was to other RDA groups and working groups outside of RDA, for example, within HL7, which wherein the interest is primarily in data management. So we did see a lot of responses come from these individuals. Again, most of the folks that responded were working with clinical research data or healthcare data. That was the largest category of data type that the folks were working with. The next largest group was actually omics data, which reflects pretty much most of the research data that is produced out of health research performing organizations. We also had a small percentage of folks who said that they do work with social sciences data, environmental data, and these individuals did so in addition to the other kind of clinical data that they worked with. So they were kind of specialized, I believe, in some manner or form. And to take us through the remaining parts where we're talking about data sharing policies, most of the respondents actually indicated that they were aware of, or very well aware of, the FAIR principles, and also familiar with the FAIR principles. In fact, there was only probably 10% of the respondents that said that the FAIR principles were new to them. And however, it also seemed to be that these respondents were asked, when they were asked about if policies existed within their organization or country with regard to sharing of research outputs. So this is not really talking about data. This is talking more about publications, data, any other kind of outputs of their research enterprise. It does seem to be that there exist policies for open public sharing, may not be open necessarily, but public sharing of these research outputs. And however, these respondents also indicated that they were not aware, or many of them were not aware of, potential updates that were being planned by the organizations downstream in the next or in the future to these policies, indicating that they are probably not, many of them were policymakers that responded to our survey. The next question focused on determining if the organizations had public statements, and about 1/3 of the respondents did say that the organizations that they belonged to had some kind of a public statement with regard to data sharing. However, surprisingly, they were not able to provide examples of the impact of this kind of data sharing. So indicating that many of them were still not sure of what the impacts were of, public data sharing. So the major, I think, interesting part, as I said, was with regard to fair data sharing and the barriers that people feel restrict data sharing in a fair manner. So we know that many of the funders as well as publishers are encouraging data sharing, specifically fair data sharing amongst their grantees and their authors. There still seem to be an idea that the incentives that are required for or that are applicable to data sharing are not really very strong. So there is definitely not sufficient amount of incentives, training with reference to the fair data sharing, as well as time and resources required for this not made available to the researchers, was the response that we saw with reference to fair data sharing. The last thing that I believe which was of interest is that there also seems to be an opinion in the research community that fair data sharing compliance monitoring is not been very well developed. So even if the funders have mandated or are requiring data sharing, the compliance of the community and the monitoring to determine if the community is complying with this data sharing is still not, has not been well implemented. And I believe that's probably what came out of the survey. So most of these responses actually fed into the guidelines that Venkat will talk about next. And I'm happy to take any questions if there are questions.
Okay. Thanks, Anu. That was a great summary of what the survey was doing. Yeah, I was just going to pause in case there were any questions, but I'm not sure there were. So if that's the case, then maybe we can move on to the actual meat of this working group, which is actually the guidelines themselves. So on screen, you can see, well, yeah, unfortunately, you're not going to be able to click on that, but the link is also in the shared notes. And we're going to switch over to that now, I think. Celia?
Yeah.
Thank you. So yes, these are the draft guidelines that we have put together. And just to clarify where initially it came from, so I'm trying to remember whether Ava actually mentioned it, but these actual draft guidelines did, in a previous version, let's say, come from the Fair for Health project, which is very much a European, Eurocentric project that ended recently. But the idea was to take that as a skeleton and flesh it out into something that was more applicable on a global scale. And indeed, we want to make sure that there's provisions for actual proper research data management, because that is a big part of what FAIR is all about, and to tailor this for HRPOs, of course. So it's intentionally quite short. It's only a couple of pages, but there's a couple of additional sections at the very end, which we'll get to later on. But it's broken down into 5 principles and 10 steps, with some sub headings in those steps as well. So I'll just quickly take you through this then. So these 5 principles. First one is to focus on the strategic vision and the leadership. So, of course, FAIR is still in the research domain amongst researchers, it is still a relative unknown. It's been around for the last 7 or so years, but for the average researcher, whichever field of research they may come from, they're unlikely to know what it's all about. And that's okay. It's they don't necessarily need to know what FAIR is, as long as we encourage them to actually fulfill what FAIR is trying to achieve. That's the main thing here. And so here, the vision and the leadership really does play a part. So, of course, you need resources and incentives. There's a lot of reluctant researchers, I think you could call them, reluctant to fulfill open science as well as FAIR principles, because they don't see the value. And this needs to be encouraged, and the resources to actually do this need to be there in place as well. And of course, in low and middle income countries, this might actually be even more of a problem, both the resources and incentives. And this needs to be really highlighted and addressed as much as possible. And of course, this can be done through knowledge and skills. Training is a huge part of this. And proper training, there's so many pieces of training available on the internet. Of course, a lot of them are focused on Europe or North America, Australia, but they are still very valid for the global stage. And this really needs to be picked up on. Indeed, we need to define who the actors are as well, and make sure that we stay focused on these, and make sure that we tailor whatever it might be, the knowledge and skills, the incentives, resources. We need to keep those actors in mind, and also have a credible timeline. And of course, finally, this all should be written down and approved by the institution. So the next part of this document is the 10 steps that we've put together. And it's really giving you a sort of blow-by-blow definition of what needs to be done, and guiding the potential implementer of these guidelines into what they need to do in a very practical sense. So from defining the vision and the objectives, looking at what is currently available and what is being performed in that institution, the kinds of data that are being produced, the kinds of infrastructure that are available. These need to be described. Also, a definition of the objectives. There's actually an open comment there, which I think is actually very valid, and I've been wondering how to include that in here. But if anyone here has other comments as well, feel free to add them into this document. Also, the adoption of a comprehensive approach to enabling mechanisms, so to actually lift the fairness in the host institution, and that will enhance the data sharing and the productivity, and of course reducing risk as well, risk of things like data loss. So secondly, there needs to be a determined agreed level of data governance, openness, transparency, and reusability for the data that's produced in the host institution. And so this can include things like licensing and provenance, as well as the mechanisms for data protection. And we've highlighted here GDPR, but of course, there are so many other models out there in different parts of the world, and this needs to be tailored to fit the local context, of course. Thirdly, we need to identify an individual or perhaps individuals that will be responsible for the policy, and then actually, of course, put it into practice. This will take the form of an action plan. So you need to state the resources and an RDM plan as well to commit to this. So you need to clearly define the roles, as we mentioned earlier, and use existing frameworks wherever possible. So there are several places where you can have competence and skills frameworks. There's been a lot of research done on this globally, and you can actually use those, reuse those for your own purposes in your local context. So fourthly here, we want to raise awareness. And of course, this all boils down to outreach and training. And this is very crucial. And something that's come about in recent years, or at least has become more prominent, is this idea of data stewards. And of course, there's a booming industry in data scientists as well. And this is something that really needs to be tapped into. So, of course, there needs to be a definition of the needed skills and a training program. So, fifthly, we need to identify and describe current and required data infrastructure. So what we're saying here is you essentially do a gap analysis. So where you're at right now and where you want to be. This depends on the level of research that is being conducted in the host institution, the HRPO. Some may be doing less research than others, but that will define how much resources should be committed in terms of financial outlay, for example. Another consideration here, of course, is geography. And again, if we're talking about LMICs, there might not be as much money available to actually build these resources, in which case you may have to rely on pre-existing tools and services, and that is a consideration that only the HRPO can make. And of course, when you're thinking about a lot of the pre-existing services, they may be commercial in nature. And if we are talking about health data, and it is inherently sensitive data, then we have to be careful about depositing or using anything that is commercial, because you then run into problems of data ownership and possible risk as well from data loss or breaches. Sorry, Celia, could you just scroll down, please? Yeah, some of that is just in those bullet points there. So the sixth point there, so we need to establish responsible RDM practices within the institution and define FAIR for implementation. So we need to do an analysis of the scope of the FAIR principles. So these are things like selection and curation, cleaning of data, stewardship, and so forth. And also to create a standard institutional template for DMPs. So DMPs are becoming ever more prominent, and whatever field of research you're in, they are actually becoming ever more used. And for HRPOs as well, I think this is a very important thing for the researchers to be doing. It gives them some focus onto what they are going to be conducting in their research at the very start of the project. And if we're talking about health data, this is the place where you will be defining the best practices in managing those pieces of sensitive data, what ethical considerations are going to be made, and so forth. And this gives the funders and any external people really a good idea of the way that data is going to be managed, and will hopefully be followed through in the course of the project. So 7 points here is that a lot of technical decisions need to be made. And I've listed, well, we've listed here some of the more common things that you might actually face when you're doing proper research data management, and also thinking about the FAIR principles. So you're thinking about things like persistent identifiers, or PIDs, metadata, ontologies, controlled vocabularies, licenses, trustworthy repositories. And in this particular case, for sensitive data and health data, you might also face the need to anonymize this data as well, or pseudo-anonymize. Another method, I should say as well, is access control mechanisms. That's another way of dealing with this type of data. But all of these things, if you're wanting to actually properly manage the data, this really needs to be taken into consideration. And in fact, if you fulfill all of these, then you can say that you're very far into making your data actually FAIR compliant. Indeed, there can be issues about making the data itself available to the outside world, but that isn't actually an issue when you're thinking about the FAIR principles. If you make the metadata discoverable, then that is actually just as good in many ways as making the underlying data itself available to the outside world. As long as you make that metadata known, that it means that any potential data reusers of that data can then go through these access control mechanisms. So the 8th point here, and this is really overlooked, and it's so important, you need to have some kind of credit and reward mechanisms, because incentivization is a big part of this. Frequently, you get asked the question that, yeah, from the researcher's perspective, what's in it for me? Why should I be doing this? Why should I be making this data FAIR compliant? It's an extra layer of bureaucracy in some sense to them. But if you can show that it will actually benefit their research, it will add value to their data, then they will actually start seeing the light about these things. So the 9th point here is that, simply put, yes, you need to write everything down and then submit it for approval and disseminate it appropriately. And crucially, you should also monitor the uptake and the compliance through perhaps such things as DMPs. And this actually leads on to this 10th point, where you need to have methods in place for evaluating the metrics and assessing the FAIR compliance. And there are indeed tools already available out there. Some of these, again, have been developed in places like in Europe, but they are actually free to use to anyone in the world. Ultimately, you want to realign and reassess the situation and consolidate the policy and make sure it's meeting funder mandates. Because of course, a lot of this research is going to be publicly funded, and you want to make sure that that data is going to be actually visible to all interested parties, the taxpayer. So those were the 10 points. And if you go further down, Celia.
Sorry, Venkat?
Oh, if you go down further, sorry.
Yeah.
No, down, sorry.
Okay, yes.
Yeah, so I put this table in here, and it was actually to address a few points that were made in previous RDA plenaries. I think more than one person mentioned this. And it was this idea of whether these guidelines should actually have a selection of tools that will actually address a variety of the points that I just described previously. Because it's all very well saying that, you know, for a researcher at least, you need to do this, you need to do that, but how do you do this? What tools are available? And so I put this table here as a selection of tools that I know of, but the problem here is, as we've stated already on a few occasions, this is very much skewed towards high-income countries, let's say. And there may be tools out there from Latin America, from Africa, from Asia, that are equally valid, and we would love to know about them, and we would love to populate these categories further. And there's actually spaces further down this table where I've left it empty for other categories that I may not have thought of. But the idea here was to actually give some time to you, the audience, to actually provide some input here. But with the limited number of people here, I'm not sure if that's actually going to happen. And also, I think we don't have adequate representation from Latin America or Africa, which is unfortunate. So I'm not sure we'll actually get any input here. One thing I'll say though is I've purposely avoided saying anything like the European Open Science Guide or EOSC, or the African Open Science Platform, which we heard about earlier today, or was it yesterday for you in Korea? These are things that are in motion, and they will actually be providing a lot of services. Indeed, there are other big open science platforms that are being created in other parts of the world. I don't know enough about these things, so I didn't want to actually put them in here, but maybe other people do. And if that's the case, then maybe we can actually include these here as well. So I'm just going to pause there if there were any questions from anyone. And also, I was just reading a note in the chat window. Right, we have to finish by 9:55. Okay. So yeah, this document is going to be open. I was going to also say that this document and the 3 previous documents that have been presented, they're going to be finalized in 1 month's time. So I'm arbitrarily saying this, but I'm not sure if the co-chairs completely agree. But I was going to say that the 29th of July would be, which is a Friday, would be a suitable time to just close all comments. and then we can look at what's going on, if there are comments, and then actually finalize it there. But we would value your input. And of course, if you can disseminate these further for comment, then that would be really appreciated. But as I said, we are wanting to actually finalize this, because this is indeed our last plenary for this working group, at least in its current incarnation. It's going to be moved over into a maintenance mode. So we want to get first versions, essentially, of these documents finalized. And then once that's done, the idea is to actually deposit these into Zenodo, where people will be able to access them freely. I don't know if the co-chairs had any comments or additional things that I might have missed there.
Yes, I would like to comment that it's really necessary the feedback of all of you. For example, a current example or a current experience that I have is that, for example, the step number two could seem obvious, but it's necessary to gather this clear step. For example, in a European project where I work, we have performed a survey on a governance model of data infrastructure. We included a question related data governance. Some respondents had not clear what is the data governance of their institutions, because it's not clearly defined in the organization. So this step could seem obvious, but it's necessary to gather the clear step for the guidelines. So all feedback is welcome.
Yeah, I would strongly support that and second that really a lot of the issues that we see, at least in the Australian context, and I assume around the world as well, what makes applying FAIR in the health research sector a different proposition from applying it in other sectors is that we're working with sensitive data. And that is, I think, front and center, and something that we saw come out of the survey analysis as well, that the #1 barrier are issues around privacy and confidentiality. And from an organizational perspective, when they're implementing policy, they have to think about it from a few different perspectives. One is their strategic perspective, and so that is a comment that I've made that is currently on screen in the document, that identifying those strategic objectives and the value proposition and the reason why an organization should adopt a policy and invest its resources into an area are key. And there are some specific ones in health, and I've provided a few examples based on consultations that I've run in Australia around this topic. And in those consultations, again, the biggest issue, and some of the things that have come up in terms of value proposition are really kind of societal benefit and societal good. But the main barrier is around the sensitivity of data and the governance of data and sensitive data. And that, for me, is really the distinguishing feature for applying FAIR, as I mentioned before. So I think the guidelines that were presented here are based on what we attempted as a very kind of, the intent was a systematic approach to do an environmental scan of the global landscape, to supplement that with surveying individuals and to draw up an impact assessment based on that. And I think all those things feed into a set of guidelines for organisations. The scientist in me wants to make the comment that in terms of limitations of the approach, I think the framework and methodology is sound. Like so many groups over the last 2 years, we've been impeded by the pandemic and ability to outreach and engage with people. And so that's hamstrung us somewhat in terms of, as Venkat alluded to, engagement with regions like South America, Africa, and to some extent Asia, and getting a broader perspective. But based on discussions, again, it comes back to sensitivity of data and the legislative and regulatory impositions or extra issues that creates there. So I think the guidelines that we have, as I was stating to the co-chairs just before, provide a good general framework for how do you do change management to implement FAIR. And as Venkat mentioned, moving over to a maintenance mode for the working group, but we do envisage that these guidelines will be taken forward and hopefully evolve over time. And personally, and I think on behalf of ARDC, where we'd like to see this develop is providing more detail addressing those specific issues for health research organisations and not research data management more generally. And a lot of that is addressing those, again, value proposition in the health research space and the drivers for that, both at an international level, but also a health consumer level and the benefits that they potentially get out of creating FAIR data. Addressing then within different health research organisations, they will have different sets of legislative and regulatory issues to consider. And then at that institutional level, defining how they're going to approach data governance for their organisation and their sensitive health data. And what we see definitely in Australia is it's those issues that are the ones that need to be addressed primarily and as a first step, so that specific, a more general, in a sense, research data management tools and methodologies like DMPs, storage, etc. Those end up being solutions to the data governance issues that the organisation identifies.
So maybe something to add on is the fact that we need to keep in mind that these are policies. These are, meant to be policies and not necessarily implementation guidelines. So I think that's a different set of questions that you would need to come up with to develop implementation guidelines that could be applicable broadly. The other thing that we've noticed, and I do realize that the pandemic impeded us in terms of, being able to do outreach, but the pandemic also provided an opportunity where more people, especially researchers, who are really the bench researchers, boots on the ground folks, were willing to share data and more willing to actually go out there and say they would be happy to, at least in the life sciences and health space, provide access to their data. And so I think this has maybe been a pivoting moment for us. We have certainly seen more amount of data being shared, um, and um, within, at least in the United States, and I'm sure it's the same across the world. So it's definitely the time to strike is now in some ways, and hope we can get some adopters for these guidelines. And maybe that is something that we want to talk about as next steps for the working group.
Indeed, yeah, and that was, I think, the next slide, was it?
Yes.
So, yeah, I think it's already been mentioned then, but and yeah, just to reiterate, these are version 1 of these documents, and this is a moving target. Maybe not the FAIR principles themselves, but how you achieve them, I think, is a moving target, and things will evolve as a consequence. And this needs to be reflected for the future. And if we're moving this working group into a maintenance mode, then that will require people to do so. And I think we, the co-chairs, have agreed that it probably requires fresh blood to be doing that as well. And we would welcome volunteers that might want to take over this role. I know I can speak for myself, at least, that I would still love to be involved in some capacity going forward. But I think in terms of actually leading things, it would probably be nice to have new people taking it forward. I don't think it would take as many as 4 co-chairs as we've done it, because I think in some ways we've done the hard work, and in terms of the maintenance, that'll require less effort. And so maybe just 1 or 2 people would be sufficient for that. But if anyone in the audience, or if you know of anyone that might actually be interested in doing so, that'd be great. Moreover, we are, as it says on the screen here, looking for early adopters because we want to validate these guidelines. So is there a host institution at HRPO that might be able to actually test this out? And again, if there's anyone in the audience, or that you know of any institution that might be willing to do this, please do get in touch. We would love to hear from you, or you can put suggestions in the shared notes document. Maybe if I were to pause, is there any comments on that? No? Okay. But yeah, it is, of course, I mean, following a scientific method, essentially, we need to validate what's being written down here. So that would really be our next steps. And of course, to finalize the documents, as I stated earlier, I think the end of July would be a good point to do that. And then we can say that this first version of these documents are completed. So what was the next slide, Celia? Was it? Yeah, we actually have a guest speaker who I don't know whether they have arrived. Beth, is that you? Ah, okay, sorry, I can see you on screen. So, so just to briefly mention, so the RDA has this domain ambassador program. It's also being done with the EOSC Future project, which I'm also part of. and Beth is here to just introduce what this is and how there may be people in this group or interested parties that might want to get on board. Beth.
Yeah, thanks. This was just meant to be like a really quick message about the fact that there is an RDA/EOSC Future Domain Ambassador call that will be coming soon. It's not currently on our website. I probably look for it in July. This is the second round of domain ambassador calls. We did do one in the spring, but this one has a little bit of a different spin on it in that we're specifically looking for domain ambassadors from certain disciplines. And one of the disciplines that we have highlighted is health sciences, which is why I'm really glad to have like just a quick minute to talk to you. I did have a slide that had a link, but I'm not sure if you got that, Venkat. So I don't know if you can share your screen with that. I can maybe circulate it to the group afterwards, just on the group email. So yeah.
Okay, let me quickly see. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, that's okay. As I said, it isn't actually posted on the website yet, but you could look at the previous call that went out in the spring. Because the criteria is basically the same, except for there's a different deadline. Obviously, it's going to be September 15th, 2022 is the deadline for the call. And the other distinction would be that we're looking for specific disciplines. Now, you can apply if you're not from one of the disciplines on the list, but we're just giving priority to certain disciplines. And just to clarify, I guess, a little bit why there is priority for certain disciplines is that there was an RDA for EOSC report that came out about a year ago, which highlighted communities that were maybe a little bit less engaged with EOSC, a little bit, mapped community awareness and readiness to engage with EOSC. So one of the things that EOSC Future is doing is attempting to improve engagement with the European Open Science Cloud. And we want to specifically ask people from the communities that were identified as being maybe a little bit less engaged to tell us a bit more about how we could engage your community better. I do want to clarify that the money does have to go to somebody residing in or working for an organization in the EU or associate countries. So I do apologize. I know this is an international group. But if you are not working in a European context and you want to get involved in some of the work that we are doing, I do have something that I am looking for experts in various fields to work with me on. And that is enhancing the sort of the disciplinary introduction pages that are on the RDA website. So if you go to the website and you click on RDA for disciplines, you'll notice that there's like kind of only a handful of disciplines that are listed there. Health sciences is not one of those disciplines, and I would love to see them represented. So obviously I need some help in writing information I need somebody else basically to write it for me. I need experts. I do have a template that you could follow, and I can circulate that to the group as well. And obviously the template is open for comment and feedback as well. So thank you very much. That was all I wanted to say. Please follow up with me if you have questions, and I can give you my email address and other links following this.
Thanks, Beth. Were you able to see my screen that I shared? I'm not sure. Okay, no problem. Okay. Well, I'm not sure if there was more that had to be said. Co-chairs?
So maybe I have a quick question for Beth. I'm just looking at the communities that you have listed. And I see that there are, possibly kind of overlapping communities that you have listed. So wondering if you're open to having folks that could potentially be part of multiple of those.
Yeah, for sure. Oh, is this? Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Yes, we're not really strictly sticking to this list. This is just a list of communities. And you're right, they are disciplines and sub-disciplines, and sometimes there is a little bit of overlap between them. Health, aging, retirement, for instance, is obviously quite related to health sciences. I didn't write the report, so I don't know exactly why that was narrowly picked out in addition to health sciences being picked out. But I do know that they looked at a range of platforms and services and metadata standards and came to the conclusions that these are disciplines and sub-disciplines that they would like to target. But yes,
and you're looking for essentially data management folks, right?
Yeah, primarily, but or researchers just in the field who have an interest in data management. Obviously, some experience with RDA previously would also be quite helpful, and I do think that that's one of the criteria that is listed in the call, which you can see from the previous round, and you will be able to see shortly in the new round.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
And just point out as well, Anna, you were talking about having multiple domains essentially there. But one of the key things about what the EOSC Future project is doing and regarding the European Open Science Cloud is to try and illustrate to the outside world about interdisciplinary research and this new frontier that we're in, where the lines are becoming ever more blurred between the different traditional fields of research. And so, mixing and matching data sets from different fields is becoming ever more present. And this would be a great way of highlighting that as well.
Actually, I'm really glad you mentioned that, Venkat, because I am specifically involved with the domain ambassadors call, but there are other calls from EOSC Future that include a cross-disciplinary research project call, which is currently listed. And that one, I think, actually has a little bit more flexibility in terms of whether or not it is fully EU-based, i.e. if you're a research project that has one EU partner, but maybe other international partners, you would be eligible for the funding.
I see. Is there a possibility to get a link? Maybe if you are going to send out a link to this domain ambassadors, could you also send out a link for the other ones? Just in case some folks are interested. Yeah.
Absolutely. I would be happy to do that.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Ava, did you have any closing words? So this is our final session. So, yeah.
I'm super happy to see what you are doing. I don't think you have to pass over the group to anybody else. I think that it's good for you to say, well, somebody has to take over, blah, blah, blah. But I think you have done such a great work. And it reminds me times before when I want to just give up something and give it to some other new blood. But I think you have done such a consistent work that is worth it to keep on the thing. I think, I mean, probably you have many other things, but and also to involve some other people. But you guys, Christian, you, Anu, and Celia, you represent the world. So that's why I think it's so important, this kind of working groups. I know that 4 chairs is too much, but the 4 chairs legitimize the coverage of the geographical approach and also the landscape of different approaches. So it's up to you guys, and also it's up to other people that are from China, from Japan, from Korea, that they will be really happy or willing to take over this work and enrich it. but I think so far is super, super interesting.
Indeed, yeah, and yeah, that's a fair point. That when the group was initially set up and the four co-chairs that we have, the idea there was to try and get some geographic coverage. We were looking for representation from Latin America and Africa as well, but unfortunately, we weren't able to. But moving things forward, it would be wonderful if we could actually fill those gaps.
Yeah, we will find out more people to add on. But adding it doesn't mean that you have to resign. I mean,
No.
It's not a question of being also co-chairs or whatever, but also at the end, thinking about my experience in RDA is that it's much more fun to have more people together working on.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
Agreed.
Yeah.
So Venkat, I think we have probably 2 more minutes before.
Yeah, we
need
have
to
2 minutes
wind up.
left, and so I
Yeah.
think we need to wind down. So thank you again, everyone, for joining, and thanks, Beth. Thanks, Eva, for also contributing there. We'll bring this to a close, and we welcome, as I say, any kind of comments that you want to feed into those documents that we presented to you. Also, if you want to just directly get in touch with us, actually, you'll be able to find our email addresses in the shared notes document. Any other reason that you might want to get in touch with us, then please do. But I think that's, yeah.
Sorry, and also I think another important thing at this point is that as soon as you have the video of this presentation, even if it is not a massive discussion, it is very good as a, as a presentation for other people. So we'll just kind of send the link to the real research health performing organizations that they could be interested in.
Absolutely, yeah. The recording will be there for people to view later on, and so hopefully we'll get some input after that as well. Thanks again, and it's good night from here, and I think good morning over there. But take care, everyone, and
Thank you,
enjoy the rest
and take
of
care,
the
yeah.
conference. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Next time,
Thank
face to face, guys.
And hopefully face to face next time.
Thank you, everybody. Good job, guys.
Thank you. Thank
Thanks,
you.
bye.
Bye.
Bye.